Nice. This is our first YouTube live. Oh wait, I should probably check it out too. See how do I check out the live from YouTube?
We're having a Teddy Riley moment right now, everyone.
Oh, there it is. Watch live, and then I'm gonna mute. Oh,
we're having a Teddy Riley. Wait, did y'all
how
get
do you
the
tell
echo
how many
too?
people are tuned in?
I think there are 3 people in here right now.
Welcome, family.
Yes, we'll give it another couple of seconds. There's a bit of a delay on the YouTube, so I got 2 devices going here. Oh no, we got more than 3 people. Okay, there's a gang of people in here. All right,
Yay.
What's up, folks? We'll focus on. I'm gonna focus my attention here because this is the live feed. Welcome everybody to another live episode of the Kinjaz podcast, Movement in the Shadows. I'm your host Ben. Got my co-host Jason Bueno of the Kinjaz. And we also got Phil Garvin of the Kinjaz. And we have 2 very special guests. I'll get into, I'm gonna introduce them in a second, but just to catch everybody up on what we've been talking about for the past, this is our 3rd week now. This is part 3 of our 3-part discussion series on allyship. And parts 1 and 2 are available on our podcast. So any streaming podcast platform, you can look it up, Kinjaz Podcast. But in part 1, we kind of started it out with an internal sort of family discussion with Kinjaz, just the brotherhood and just kind of just getting out some thoughts and questions and just a very open and honest, vulnerable space where we're just trying to understand where we're at in light of just the recent just the unrest with racial inequality and police brutality, and us trying to get a grip on what that means in light of us specifically with even in our community. And in part 2 last week, we had Kimmy Manikis, who kind of helped us explore a little bit more on the internal processing side of things and how to understand terminology that's kind of being seen a lot on social media, a lot of the things that we're kind of learning for the first time and sort of understanding those terms. And then from a place of understanding, asking ourselves questions of why we think certain ways, why we think things are wrong or right, and ultimately how to externally take those things to our, conversations with our families, our friends, in our workplaces. And so in this part 3, we wanted to take it a little bit the next step further, the what's next sort of steps, and recognizing that there is a lot to be done on a ground level in terms of the voting. We have a voice, we have a vote, we have the ability to enact change. And so our very special guests today, we have Shea Crowder and Diane Wong. Hello, ladies. I'm gonna just do a brief intro. Shea Crowder is completing her PhD at Princeton University. In the fall, she'll begin as a professor at Loyola Marymount University in LA, California. Her research interests include Black politics and intersectional American politics. And Diane Wong is a professor and multimedia storyteller based in New York City, born and raised in Flushing, Queens in New York City. Her research is intimately tied to the Asian diaspora and urban immigrant experience. She is a member of the Chinatown Art Brigade and co-founder of the WOW Project, a community initiative based out of Wing On Wo and Company, the oldest store in Manhattan's Chinatown. And you can follow them both on Instagram at Shea Crowder, and Diane is at Expert Demon. We'll plug those Instagram handles in the show notes. Shea and Diane, welcome. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We are doing this via Zoom and YouTube Live because you guys are remote, different parts of the world. Thank you, technology, that we can do this.
Yay.
Right? Rock on. But thank you guys so much for coming on. And, as we've been prepping for this 3rd episode, we've been talking a lot because we wanted to make sure that we can structure it in a way where we can kind of hit the points that we feel are going to be relevant and important to us to learn from, as well as our community and our, in particular, the dance community that we have a strong sort of following and reach to. And so, we were trying to figure out how do we kind of package everything into kind of an hour-long conversation. So I kind of just wanted to open up the floor to you ladies in terms of your thoughts. I don't know if you had a chance to kind of, listen in on the previous two, but just wanted to kind of open the floor to you ladies.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ben. I'll start and then I'll hand it off to Diane. So good evening, Ben, Jason, Phillip. Thank you all so much for inviting Diane and myself to be a part of this conversation. When we first connected a week or so ago, one of the sort of questions that we discussed and one of the themes that we talked about during that time is a sort of question of now what? I think that's a particularly relevant question at this time. Over the past few weeks and months, people have become kind of newly sort of awakened and energized surrounding addressing issues of anti-Blackness in this country in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Tony McDade. Police brutality and state-sanctioned violence is one form of discrimination that Black people face, but there are other more intimate forms of insidious anti-Blackness that African Americans experience in this country on a daily basis. So as we consider how we are going to continue to show up as allies in this moment and what we want to do next, I want to push us to consider what it means to be an ally, or better yet, an accomplice. The term ally generally refers to someone who shows solidarity, generally on a temporary basis with a group that they're not a part of. An accomplice, on the other hand, requires a sort of collaboration and a disruption of the status quo. While allyship generally seems polite, being an accomplice requires doing disruptive work that is not easy, polite, or well packaged. In fact, being an accomplice might cost you something. So in addition to asking the question of now what do we do next? Another question that we might consider is, what are the costs that we have to pay to show up for and to support Black people in this moment? I'm really excited about this conversation, and Diane, with that, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Shaya, for pulling me into this. We're part of a Women of Color writing group together, and that's sort of how it happened. Thank you, Ben, Phil, and Jason for hosting us. My name is Diane. I come to you from the unceded territories of the Lenape Lenape people, and my pronouns are she, hers. I'm currently a writer, an educator, artist, and professor based in Flushing, Queens, in New York City. Full-time wise, I write and teach on Asian American politics, race, gender, and sexuality, cultural media studies, youth activism, and community engaged research. I'm an active member of the Chinatown Art Brigade and co-founder of the WOW Project, which is a community initiative that combats gentrification and displacement and is based out of the oldest store in Manhattan's Chinatown, Wing on Wo & Co. Over at 26 Mott Street. And so I would say that I came into this work during college. A pivotal moment for me was when I took my first ethnic studies and Asian American studies class called Asian Americas. I remember the first moments when I read Carlos Bolosan's Americas in the Hearts, Gary Okahiro's Margins and Mainstreams, and Ronald Takaki's Strangers from a Different Shore. Yes, those were the first times I really saw my own ancestral histories reflected in writing, and that was so powerful, right? Those were also the first moments that I realized that the histories of my people were so intimately interwoven with the histories of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And we rarely get the chance to learn about these intersectional histories, right? And these powerful interstitial moments of solidarity, of intimacy and struggle between our communities. And there's a good reason for this, right? Because they don't want us to, because white supremacy and the systems, the laws, the policies, the politics sort of set it up in a way that pits our communities against each other, right? So our communities are always in paradox. And I learned about all of this the hard way through conversations with my own immigrant family members, right? And noticing the insidious ways in which anti-Black sentiments become normalized over time, across months, years, decades. And so the reality is that anti-Blackness is so deeply ingrained into the collective memory of Asian immigrant refugee communities, right? Upon arrival here in the United States, but also from experiences in the home country. To even begin talking about solidarity, right, requires us as Asian Americans to uncover the root cause of where our anti-Black ideologies stem from, right? And our own families' complicated histories with colonialism, with imperialism, war of violence, migration, casteism, and labor, right? To move towards transformative change with Black communities is to look internally and to really ask ourselves, how am I anti-Black? How have I reproduced anti-Blackness, or the things that enable violence against Black folks, and in particular, Black, queer, and trans communities? What do I need to unlearn, and what do I need to relearn, right? And in line with the themes of the podcast tonight, much of what is still left to learn for Asian Americans is within the political realm. Asian Americans are a highly diverse electorate, including Thai, right, Indian, Filipino, Korean, Chinese, Pakistani, Cambodian, Laotian, Bangladeshi, Nepalese, Burmese, right, voters, among many other groups. Between 2000 and 2020, the number of Asian American eligible voters more than doubled in the United States, growing by 139%. Asian Americans play an increasingly important role in shaping both national and local elections, right? And despite the fact that the media and some academics often portray Asian Americans as an apolitical sleeping giant, is a term that they love, right? Asian Americans actually have a very long history of involvement in politics and political mobilization, right? Around issues of policing, affordable housing, displacement, employment, abortion. And for us to even be using the term Asian American right now tonight is a political commitment and a nod to the past. Berkeley students Yuji Ichioka and Emma G, who, inspired by the Black Power movement and the protests against Vietnam War, coined the term Asian American in defiance and in rejection of mainstream labels for at the time, like Oriental. And so we owe it to Black activists who paved the way for Asian Americans to create our own narratives, right? And to fight for self-determination. And so I'll delve deeper into some of these histories of solidarity and some of the more substantive issues so that we can think more deeply about the possibilities and also limitations of Asian American politics in the fight for Black liberation.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that paints us a really good picture of like a starting point. And I think that's where we've also, in our previous two conversations, been trying to understand, you know, I think everybody has their own experience when it comes to, let's say, just from our personal place, from the API sort of, you know, experience growing up in the United States. You know, we had immigrant parents that, you know, immigrated here from their respective countries from Asia, and then raising us in their understanding of what this American dream is. And so a lot of, even, I'll just speak for myself, a lot of like my own thoughts in terms of what it means to be successful and how to get there. And not only the concept of success, but even on a societal standpoint, the way that I view myself as an Asian American in light of this place where I am essentially a foreigner, because my parents have kind of put that into my head that we're foreigners here. So we need to work harder. We need to, you know, kind of, it's not going to be as easy for us. You know what I'm saying? And that was kind of just my sort of experience. And even in terms of, to be totally honest, the importance of voting was never really like put upon me, even by my parents, other than maybe the president. And so I never really understood what the role and the absolute, you know, like necessity for understanding what level of vote I even have and what I should be even like aware of, you know? So, in light of, all of all types of, from the local level to obviously to the national level that we have the ability, what role would you say that elections have in light of our current climate right now?
Ben, I'll chime in there. Thank you so much for sharing some of your own experience and how that's kind of sort of reflected your questions and also your stance and your orientation towards thinking about voting. So yeah, in this moment, people have hit the streets. We've seen people protesting. And 2020 is a really novel and interesting year for a lot of reasons, right? We're in the midst of a global pandemic. We're in this sort of racial reckoning that's happening across the country. And it is also simultaneously an election year. And so a sort of kind of natural follow-up to the politics that we've seen in the streets is how should this map on to what we see in the voting booth, right? And what'll go down in November. The presidential election, I really can't overstate the importance of getting, the man who's currently in office, Donald Trump, out of office. I think that this is something that is mutually beneficial for all sort of marginalized groups at the intersection of race, immigrant status, gender, sexuality, as well as other axes of marginalization, Trump has shown to be sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, and downright racist, and that's all in the past week. And so, as we consider the different communities who supported Trump, I think, it's important to also acknowledge that over 25% of Asian Americans did in fact vote for Trump in the 2016 election. Now, of course, that looks different when you break that and you disaggregate that data across Asian American immigrant groups and also across generation. And I think that what that kind of speaks to also is the importance of having these hard conversations at home with regard to the election, with regard to who you're going to be supporting. And beyond thinking about the sort of presidential vote choice on the ballot, because I think to many people they sort of understand the top-down importance of that. I think it's also important to kind of think about our elections at the local level. Right now there have been calls to defund the police. There have been calls for abolition. There have been calls for affirmative action, things that we'll kind of get into the meat and potatoes of understanding later. But in terms of figuring out how those policies are actually passed, how these concepts turn into actionable policies, that's where it's important to kind of think about the role of the Attorney General, our mayors, our chairs, our school board representatives. And so as you enter the voting booth this November, something that is incredibly important is to know your ballot before you get into the voting box, right? And so one resource that I'll plug is vote411.org. You can put in your zip code there and you'll get a sort of cheat sheet with an overview of the candidates and some of their policy positions. And so as we think about moving forward to the next election, and in some ways, the ways in and outside of voting we show up politically in this moment, it's also really important to think about local politics. Later on, I'll discuss some of the ways that we can show up outside of the voting booth, but it's important to also remember that elections are one tool in a broader sort of toolkit of political engagement, right? So voting definitely is a source of harm reduction, but it's not necessarily the place at which all sort of radical political change happens, right? And so, yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now and kind of talk about some of the other ways we can show up later.
Awesome. And also just for you guys watching right now on YouTube, feel free to plug in questions in the chat on YouTube, and we're gonna try to get to answer as many of those at the end of this conversation. So yeah, if you guys have any questions with the things that we're talking about now, and even the things that we talk about, some of the resources, websites, and all sorts of those sorts of things, I'm gonna plug those into the show notes so that you guys can reference those things later. But yeah, so Shay, I love how you hit some kind of hot buttons in terms of, in my mind, some buzzwords, things like defunding the police, affirmative action, abolition, reparations, things like that, things that are, I call those hot button words because, I mean, if anyone's been out to the protests, I'm sure you've seen them on signs, and you're seeing a bunch of posts on Instagram. So can you sort of maybe walk us through maybe even some of the definitions? Because I've heard a lot of different perspectives on the defunding the police, and people essentially defining it in a way where it can be problematic if you define something incorrectly, right? So, you know, can you kind of maybe, walk us through maybe some of the definitions of what those terms mean and what they would essentially be doing, you know, say if those things actually push through?
I can take a shot at this. So I would say first to follow the lead of Black organizers in your cities, right, and the demands that are coming out of the movement for Black lives. Black leaders have successfully been calling, right, for defunding of police and police departments, while at the same time calling for the investment of resources, right, in Black communities and Black youth and Black institutions. 2 weeks ago, the Minneapolis City Council approved removing police, disbanding the police department. And just 2 days ago, right, the Madison School Board approved removing police from schools. And so make no mistake, this is the result of years of grassroots organizing and sustained pressure, right, on the ground. But these changes are possible. Asian Americans should push at the local and national levels to defund the police. I know that a lot of Asian Americans have long been advocating for the defunding of ICE and immigration detention centers, right, that have torn so many South and Southeast Asian families apart. But police and ICE are products of the same system, right, to surveil and murder Black people and immigrants. And so it's important for Asian Americans to know that there's nothing natural about this modern day system of policing that we're seeing, right? And that the origins of policing are so deeply interwoven in our nation's long and violent history of slavery and slave patrol, right? So we have to get our communities, our parents on board to see that defunding the police is actually not that radical of an idea, especially when the state has had such a long history of defunding things like education, health, social services. And so it's really time to push back. And so we need to dismantle the idea that the police and the surveillance state keeps us safe, right? We need to reimagine what wellness and what community safety can look like. And so the second policy area would be affirmative action. As many of you probably already know, affirmative action was instituted at the federal level in an effort to increase women, right? The representation of women, but also racial minorities in areas of employment and education. Unfortunately, affirmative action has since been a controversial issue among some Asian Americans, right? In particular with East Asian and South Asian Indian communities who've been mobilizing to ban affirmative action programs and university race-based admissions. A recent example of this was when a group called Students for Fair Admissions filed a lawsuit at the federal district court in Massachusetts against Harvard, right, claiming that the university discriminates against Asian American applicants. Currently on the California ballot is an amendment known as ACA 5, which would repeal an affirmative action ban that was put in place nearly 2 decades ago, allowing for race-conscious admissions at public universities, places like UCs, right? And so there's a vocal minority of Asian parents who have been successfully mobilizing to defeat this measure, right? This has happened before, and much of it has been taking place on social media platforms like WeChat and getting pressed like in ethnic newspapers. And so this is sort of ironic, right? When the reality is that the vast majority of Asian Americans have historically and continue to support affirmative action, right? So I think it's really critical, especially, you know, the youth tuning in, to call in your family members to affirm the need for policies at the local, state and national level that remedy ongoing disparities, right, through affirmative action. And so the third policy area I do want to uplift is reparations. I really want Asian Americans to grapple with the question of reparations and sort of the question that Shea started us off with, right? The question of what are we willing to let go? And this is not a test of our imagination or about theoretical pinnings or what if questions, right? I'm talking about reparations as a pathway for a more livable future, understanding that when Black lives are free, we all get free. Reparations as a system of redress for harms and injustice is nothing new, right? And there is historical precedence of this. For instance, after Japanese internment during World War II, the government dispersed $1.6 billion in reparations for Japanese Americans who had been interned, right, as well as their family members. And so there is precedence for this kind of movement, right, for reparations in this country, and Asian Americans must listen to and organize alongside Black communities to demand reparation legislation at the federal, right, and state level for past and continuing harms from slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, incarceration, surveillance, cultural exploitation, right, all these things. And this is long overdue, right, and requires us as Asian Americans to really grapple with the question of what are we willing to let go of, to give up in our own lives, right, to make this a reality. So I'm thinking about our own privileges, right, power and access. What are we willing to throw down, right? Are we willing to be made uncomfortable? Are we willing to raise the stakes?
Thank you for sharing that, Diane. Given what you just shared right now about, like, you know, asking that really important question, what are we willing to let go as far as like the privileges, the access, and even circling back what you said in the opening remarks as far as doing the disruptive work. And I want to know if you can kind of expand a little bit regarding like how has anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism manifested in Asian American communities?
Yeah, definitely. So just scaling back a little bit, right? To combat anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism requires us to sort of recognize it first, and to understand the nuanced differences between terminologies like anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism, so that when we talk to our family members and our communities, we have precise language to talk about these systems. And so how I explain this to my family members is this, right? The idea of anti-Blackness stems from the fundamental ideology that Blackness, right, that darkness is associated with deviance, punishment, criminality, and marginalization, while anti-Black racism are the various systems set in place that uphold the idea that Black lives are criminal, right? And it's perpetuated through the media, politics, law, education. And so, as I mentioned earlier, anti-Blackness is so deeply ingrained in the collective and reflexive memory of Asian immigrants and refugee communities. And so it's really no secret then that anti-Blackness is reflected in our culture, right? In how we interact with each other, businesses, institutions, at the interpersonal level on a daily basis. And therefore, it's really important to name the insidious ways in which anti-Blackness has become normalized over time within our families, within our communities, and within our institutions, right? A few examples that come to mind involve relationships, right? When our parents make comments about who we're allowed to date, right? Or build in community with. The ways in which lighter skin is associated with beauty, right? And the proliferation of skin whitening creams throughout Asia. And a global market that is profiteering off of anti-darkness. The ways in which Asian Americans stay silent when a Black person is being harassed or profiled at the park, right, at the store, at school, on the streets. The ways in which Asian Americans internalize and perpetuate the model minority stereotype, which ultimately upholds white supremacy and hurts us all. The ways in which Asian Americans consume Black culture, right, without really acknowledging its roots or channeling resources back to Black communities. And so these are, you know, everyday examples of how anti-Black racism permeates our daily lives and how we continue to participate in it, right? And so Asian Americans still have a lot of work to do when it comes to educating ourselves, right? Looking internally at our families, our communities, and thinking about how we're complicit, right? But also thinking about what are ways to divest in whiteness so that we can invest in each other. I hope that answers.
Oh, I did. Thank you so much. Yeah, just to also get like a more whole kind of picture. I know you shared earlier about the kind of intersectional histories. Can you give some examples regarding the Afro-Asian Solidarity? Because I know you kind of briefly mentioned it earlier, but could you expand on that?
Yeah, so part of this resource toolkit that will probably go out later is a syllabus, of course, on Afro-Asian Solidarity politics that I taught 2 semesters ago at NYU. And their recommended readings each week is separated by theme, right? And there's so many things that Asian Americans can do to divest in whiteness. And part of that, right, is exactly learning about our own histories and histories of cross-racial solidarity. So how can we look to the past and into our entangled colonial histories for examples of solidarity and resistance? You might, if you do, right, you might learn about Asian indentured or coolie laborers, right? That there once was a coolie narrative that formed a counterpart to the slave narrative. Coolie laborers from India and China were contracted out to plantations in Southeast Asia and the Americas, largely in efforts to harden racial boundaries of Western and white dominance, right? And to legitimize the institution of slavery. You might learn that there was once an anti-imperialist fighter in the Philippines named David Fagan, who was a Black soldier who defected from the US Army upon arrival in the Philippines to join the Filipino Revolutionary Army after witnessing the horrors inflicted upon Filipino peoples. Right? You might learn about Yuri Kochiyama, who worked alongside Malcolm X and militant Black national organizations in Harlem to fight for freedom and justice. And recently, right, you might have read about the Minnesota Asian American officer who turned his back on George Floyd, right, as he was fighting for his last breath. There was a image circulated of him visibly turning his back on the murder scene, right? But many of us probably don't know that at one of the rallies at Minnesota State Capitol stood a woman named Yua Vong, who passionately spoke, right, about Black liberation. Vong, a refugee from Laos, lost her son, Phong Lee, after he was shot and killed by the Minneapolis police officer, Jason Anderson, in 2006. Vong, right, said in front of the crowd at the protest, "I want the family to know that I will grieve with them. I will continue to speak out and support those voices that have been taken away from us." Right, these are the connections between our communities, right, and the moments of solidarity that the media and our education system don't want us to see because they're so dangerous to the logics of white supremacy, right? And it is in these moments of connections between our communities that freedom dreams become possible and that we move closer towards Black liberation, which is liberation for all, right? At the same time, I think it's also really important to acknowledge the fact that while our struggles are so deeply interwoven, they're not the same, right? Black people have been targeted by the state and systematically dehumanized in ways that Asian Americans and Asian immigrant refugee communities will never know or face.
Powerful. Thank you, Diane. So I know we were talking about policy issues just a moment ago, and then talking about this intersectional histories, but also the current narratives. Can either you, Shea, or Diane speak about like how can we get involved in politics beyond the ballot box at the local levels? I know that was something you shared earlier, Shea.
Yeah, I'll chime in there. And Diane, thank you so much for providing that historical context surrounding Afro-Asian solidarity, as well as limitations posed by anti-Blackness And I think as we consider kind of the ways to sort of move forward and to demonstrate this form of solidarity, and in Diane's words, divest in whiteness and invest in one another, I think it's very important to kind of think about the ways we're going to show up politically for one another outside of election years, right? So every 4 years we vote for the president, every 2 years we have midterm elections, but how do we hold these elected officials accountable during the off season, right? And so there are several ways that I would recommend to, spend time, holding our elected officials and policymakers accountable. And remember, being an accomplice or being an ally is something that requires a cost, right? And so that cost, it can be related to time. If that means making phone calls or emailing your city council people with regard to policies being passed surrounding the budget, for example, as we talk about defunding the police, or affirmative action as we kind of think about ACA 5, right? It's been my experience that, like, crazily enough, despite the numerous emails that people have coming in, if you send an email and you state that you are a constituent and you have XYZ concerns, oftentimes, even if it's just something that's being sent to everyone, there's some sort of response, right? There's some engagement and there's some documentation on their end that a complaint was made, right? Another thing that people can do is to attend hearings, to go to City Hall. For those here in Sacramento, you can testify at hearings for bills when policies are being passed, and kind of let your voice be heard in that way. Outside of protesting, obviously, like when we get out of like COVID-19 and everything going on in this moment, but attending hearings and like physically showing up to let your perspective be documented and shared, it matters, right? Earlier this week, I was watching some of the testimony from the assembly hearing that took place on June 10th surrounding ACA 5, the bill that would repeal Prop 209, the affirmative action policy. And I think it was really powerful to hear some of the sort of understandings of AfroAsian Solidarity, as well as it was also kind of troubling, right, to kind of hear some of the same sort of perpetuations of anti-Blackness that has sort of like facilitated this sort of false narrative surrounding this Asian penalty when it comes to admissions to selected institutions. And so in thinking about how you can kind of use your voice when it comes to speaking to these issues and talking to your elected officials who are accountable to you, those are a couple of considerations. For those who want to really get involved and show up on a more regular basis, there are things like community boards that exist in your local town, right? You can apply online, and in those community board meetings, you are someone who is engaging directly with your local representatives, whether that be your city council people or your state assembly people or senators, right? And there are a number of committees that you can also join depending on what your community interests are. I was a part of my community board in Harlem, Community Board 9, and I was a member of the Youth Education and Libraries Committee. And there we spent a lot of time talking about investment in schools, issues surrounding co-location, and how our budget is allocated in our district. There are also committees for those interested in senior issues, housing and land use and zoning, right? And so these are costly things in terms of time, but if time is not a resource that you have available, there's also literal investment with money. Investing in Black grassroots organizations, Black queer-led organizations like Black Youth Project 100, right? Like the Dream Defenders, and also supporting grassroots organizations that work on anti-racism and allyship, organizations like Not in Our Town. And so these are a few of the ways that I want to encourage people to kind of consider staying actively involved and holding elected officials accountable outside of election years. Also, donations when it comes to the election, right? So I want to plug the Collective PAC, which is a group that supports Black candidates running for office. And yeah, I'll end with that. Thanks.
Thanks. Anything you'd like to add to that, Diane?
Literally everything Shaya just said. It's on point. And so I guess for anyone who wants to get a little bit more involved, really just taking the time to learn about your elected officials, you'd be surprised at what you'd learn, right? And their policy platforms. Do they represent the voices in your community? Do they represent your voice? Or is it time to vote in someone new? Right. And there really is no right way to participate. As Jaya mentioned, voting is one part of a much larger picture, right? And the reality is not everyone has access to the ballot box. And this is especially true for the 1 in 7 Asian Americans who are undocumented at the moment, right? But that doesn't mean that there is no other way to participate in politics. Learn about the issues on your block, in your neighborhood, in your city. There are a lot of resources online about where you can donate, all of the orgs just mentioned, right? And how to join local groups. I do want to uplift the names of 2 Black trans groups, including the Okra Project and For the Growls, which has created Nina Pop and a Tony McDade mental health recovery fund, right? And so if you're looking for places to donate, those are options. There's always something happening, right, in your local community at the local level that you can do and support. But I think it's also important to scale back, right? Before you do that, check in with yourself about what you can bring to the table. How you show up to the work also matters, right? Are you entering the space willing to affirm and listen to Black organizers and Black leaders? What actions are you willing to commit to this week? What actions are you willing to commit to 3 weeks from now, 3 months from now, or a year from now? Beyond this political work, are you thoughtfully building relationships with Black people in your daily lives? Right? I think those are all important questions to center and uplift.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That's really good. Yeah, as I'm just, listening, I'm really taking in everything as just straight up learning, and a lot of the things that I think the pressure that I feel like maybe we put on ourselves when we feel overwhelmed by new knowledge, and this like, man, I've just been asleep this whole time, or I haven't been exercising this ability, not only the ability, but like kind of responsibility that I have as a citizen here. And I know that we're talking in like, Shea, thank you so much for laying out so many of the different things that we can be doing actively, right, to be in our local communities. And so, obviously the ballot box has a lot to do to enact change. And even within, what like our immediate circle within, say, Kinjaz, and what we do in terms of what we're known for, and like essentially we're an artist crew, right, or an entertainment based company. And a lot of our, even probably people are tuning in tonight that follow us are, within our dance community. And I guess like, my question is even to kind of expand on, okay, so voting's one way, and being involved in attending these, community meetings and gatherings and stuff like that are important to kind of stay informed. But, if we have this ability, this reach, whether it be through, the art form of dance, whether it's music, whether it's painting, what have you, I know that there's a lot of amazing art that is being created. And, I think there's also, well, I would want to touch on that, like, in terms of what role does art and like sort of like, cultural building, play into something like this. And also on the other side of that, kind of as like a like a follow-up question, because of, this fear of cancel culture, of doing the wrong thing, or I don't want to put something out because it may seem ignorant, or I don't know all the facts. So I think there's something there too, where I would love to hear your thoughts in terms of, because the intention is to obviously do good and to be an ally, and sometimes you might not hit the mark all the time. And, but in the spirit of uniting and to essentially be on the same team, how can we sort of, be responsible to do your due diligence in terms of educating yourself on what it is in terms of whatever messaging that you want to put out through your art. Make sure you know what you're actually saying, but then also being so bold to put that out there, because artists in general are very sensitive and they're very, sensitive about their work. And so that itself is already hard, but then especially when you're trying to put something out that's very kind of essentially touchy in the moment, like how would you, maybe I would just love to hear your thoughts in terms of being able to use our art and then also do it in a way where, you can kind of be bold about it. I know that's kind of a loaded question. It's kind of big, but yeah.
So I can take a shot at that. As a cultural organizer and an artist, right? I can't emphasize enough everything that you said, Ben. That artistic expression, right? And thinking about just like transgressive forms of like aesthetic production have always played an important role in shaping social change. And I just want to backtrack in thinking about this rich legacy of Asian American cultural resistance, right? On the East Coast, where I'm based, right, where a lot of my work takes place, New York's Chinatown was historically a hub for Asian American political organizing through the work of different cultural collectives, right, that came together to advocate for transformative change in their communities. And so in the late 1960s, as an example, in New York City, a group of, like artists, dancers, muralists, musicians, and activists came together literally in the basement of a tenement building on Catherine Street to form what later became known as the Basement Workshop, right? Largely influenced by conversations around Black Power, Third World Liberation, and anti-Vietnam War protests. These early members of the Basement Workshop Collective came together to create change through art. It was a space for younger Asian Americans to use their own artistic practice, whatever form it might be, right, to address issues like neighborhood displacement, gentrification, inadequate healthcare, poverty, unemployment, right? And so this legacy of Asian American arts and cultural production continues today in different formations and in new collectives. There's also a long history of Black and Asian American cultural collaboration, right? Thinking about the saxophonist Fred Ho, right? And the AfroAsian Music Ensemble that was based in New York, and to contemporary moments like the creation of the beautiful mural of Malcolm and Yuri in Harlem, right? So at the most fundamental level, art changes how we relate to each other on a human level, right? And allows us to create the foundation for a new world, right? To dream together and to create the space to be able to dream together.
Yeah, I think too, I'm gonna chime in real quick. Also understand like art is activism, right? So we as artists should understand the power of art or of our art and be intentional with it. And if you think about art's role throughout, we'll reference civil rights, just documenting the time, right? Documenting its history, documenting what was happening. If you think about the, the spark of like the Emmett Till photograph, right? Like that photograph being published in Jet magazine, right? The world suddenly was aware of the brutality of American racism. So in regards to art's role in, when it comes to social justice and change, like it's massive and it's huge and it's powerful. And I just think that we as artists need to move with intention when we're putting our art out.
That's a great point, Phil. On that note, I'm wondering whether yourself or anyone else, art and activism, or in any other, I guess, field, any other industry, how can we instill an ethics of care in this kind of work, in this activism, getting involved, and even back to what you shared, Diane, about how we're able to further relate to each other? It's a tough question.
I mean, I agree with everything. Ben, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of piggyback off of what Phil just said. You know, as you're kind of talking about, like, kind of just art kind of being this sort of documenting, like, essentially artists are documentarians, right? Just the way that you put it, like, we're showing the sign of our times, like what's happening in the world, and showing it through a perspective that may be not the most conventional way to look at something, but it can, I mean, what makes art so effective is its profoundness, where it can be a bit, I don't want, maybe shocking is not the right word, but it can take you aback, right? And I think some of the most effective and you know, profound pieces are the ones where people may not have expected something to be said in such a way or shown in such a way. And I think that's kind of also, this could be, I mean, art is all subjective in terms of what people's personal tastes and what they gravitate towards. But I think sometimes the shock value of art, not to shock for the sake of shocking, but to make a statement sometimes, you know, when I see something that kind of like makes me speechless, it's because it did something to me where it's like, whoa, got it. Like, that was pretty, you know what I mean? Like, that's a bold statement, and I get it. It may make me even feel uncomfortable. And I guess, you know, I'm even speaking as I'm processing, like I'm saying as I'm processing, even as, you know, artists myself, and for Kinjaz and what we do and what we create, there's got to be a bit of you know, boldness and fearlessness, and not to be mistaken for recklessness, but fearlessness in terms of, I believe what I'm saying is something that I really believe. And that's, I think that's art, right? You gotta, there's something that's kind of gotta be at risk when you want to be an artist, because yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, it's all subjective. You can have safe art too, which is fine. But and even at that, as I asked that question about the fear of being canceled and whatnot, you know, worst case scenario, you get canceled, you bounce back. You know what I'm saying? And I think
even to kind of chime in there, you know, about the idea of like, you get canceled, you bounce back. I think, you know, the thing is, as people kind of approach their work in this moment, I think it's really important to just be okay admitting when you were wrong. And just saying, hey, you know, I approached that from the wrong angle. I learned something in this process. Admitting when you're wrong, genuinely apologizing for it, and kind of moving forward, right? It's like, no one is born perfectly woke or with this sort of well-formed idea of the ways in which anti-racism works in this country. In fact, for those of us who went to school here or have been in the United States for all of our life, we've experienced this process of indoctrination with regard to racism and anti-Blackness that now we have to kind of actively unlearn, right? And so I think that it's important to kind of just be in this sort of continuous space, to be willing to kind of unlearn and do the process of learning sort of new habits and new practices of solidarity and care for one another.
Yes, I vibe with
I like that. Sure. It makes me think too of, you know, as artists, understanding what our intentions are, but also the impact of the art. And oftentimes I often think, you know, there's that fine line if it's more about the message or the messenger. And as artists, it can get a little bit of gray area, you know, and that's where I think the deep introspective work really kind of comes into play. you know, on the surface level, it's like, no, I'm all about this cause and about, you know, the message I'm trying to sending, but we can sometimes deceive ourselves of like wanting more to be shine upon ourselves as opposed to what it's really trying to reach.
Jason, as you kind of asked that question of instilling an ethics of care, I guess, you know, even just in relation to what we had just kind of talked about, the balance of, you know, being bold to speak up and to just to move on what you feel passionate about. And also, you know, we had touched on this even in the last episode of this concept of activism fatigue and the privilege that it is for, you know, non-Black people of color to be able to, or you know, just non-Black people in general to be able to kind of shut off because we're tired, and you know, and that also is a product of our privilege. So, you know, I'd love to even, I mean, from your perspective and from your field of expertise too, Jason, like, yeah, in terms of how we can care for ourselves, but to, yeah, I don't know, stay in the fight and not, you know what I mean? Like, how do we kind of balance that fine line?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Oh, go ahead, Shay.
Oh, okay. I think that's a really, really good question. I'm glad that you're pushing us to kind of think sort of beyond the realm of conventional politics and kind of consider the ways in which these sort of new actions should kind of be manifested in our everyday lived experiences and like smaller sort of interactions, right? And so for me, as a Black woman, it's really important that beyond the time in which these topics are trending on social media and, you know, a part of the mainstream media cycle, that people continue to kind of keep this same energy and carry this sort of like ethics of care and commitment to anti-Blackness throughout sort of everyday conversations, right? Water cooler conversations when we're back in the office. You know, I think it's really important what you're saying about people when they're not in the rooms, you know, especially kind of keeping in mind the fact that Black people oftentimes aren't in those rooms of sort of influence and power, right? So if you have a seat at the table, using that seat to kind of uplift and amplify Black voices. I think, you know, in things that kind of seem small, right? When there are interactions that happen where there's kind of like a tinge of sort of anti-Blackness or racial bias, you know, I can think of times in graduate school when people would say, oh, Shea, you know, you'll have no problem on the job market. Black people always do fine. As a Black woman, you'll definitely get a job, right? And people not saying anything in that moment when those things are being said, but kind of getting a text later being like, oh, you know, that was so fucked up. People are stupid. And it's like, it would have really kind of meant something if someone said something right then when it was happening, right? In the face of sort of anti-Blackness, to kind of be present and to acknowledge the ways in which things that we've kind of become used to and that we've become accustomed to are not in fact okay, right? And so, yeah, I in the same way that I can kind of think of these sort of experiences of anti-Blackness when I haven't had allies present, I can also think of very clear and concrete experiences of Afro-Asian solidarity. When I was on the job market, I met with an Asian American scholar at a place where I was interviewing, and he candidly told me his salary. You know, and I think that's another way that we can kind of continue to show up for people. You know, we know that Black people in particular experience a pay gap, you know, relative to white men. Black women make 61 cents on the dollar. I think for Black men, it's closer to around 89 cents on the dollar. Whereas Asian Americans generally kind of fare better when it comes to salary and income. And so being willing to kind of have these open conversations and make sure that your Black brothers and sisters are also receiving equal pay. I think that these are kind of some of the ways that in our daily sort of lives, without really going too far out of your way, we can, you know, show solidarity and show up for one another.
I like what you said just now, Shea, and you know, a lot of things just kind of come to my mind about that, of just really having more courage and being able to be vulnerable in those difficult situations, even as you said, like the water cooler and whatnot. And if I can add to that, is also like, as what you shared earlier, like how can we be more accountable within ourselves? And given it in my field, particularly my training and specializing in depth psychology, we often talk about shadow work. And I think it really is reflective of Kinjaz as an organization, where one of our mantras is movement in the shadows. And I think being able to see that on two levels, one on the outward level of like, can I keep doing this work even when no one's around, even when no one knows about it and sees it, that I'm able to keep, be consistent and persistent in this kind of work where I may not be acknowledged about it, but just knowing that this is what I believe in and what I want to stand for. The other part to that, in terms of like movement in the shadows and doing this kind of shadow work, is really kind of acknowledging the parts within ourselves that we don't want to admit, we don't want to acknowledge. It's so easy for us to kind of point to the other of like, ooh, they're the ones that are racist. They're the ones that are homophobic. They're the ones that are, any kind of phobias or isms. But if we're able to really kind of take an honest look within ourselves and really do that deep work to really understand the shadow within ourselves, then I think that's what could also really kind of like let the work that we do be lifelong, a lifelong commitment.
Yeah, that's really dope. Even as we have these mantras that we have as sort of these pillars that for ourselves, we always check ourselves by our mantras, kin at all costs, respect all, fear none, and movement in the shadows. And I think even as we kind of go through the times, our definitions for those things even evolve and mature, and they take on so much, just so many different shapes. And Jason, I love how you even just kind of painted that picture of movement in the shadows. I think that's awesome. Yeah, we wanted to give some time for Q&A, but I don't think any questions came in, which is totally fine. I mean, just whoever is tuning in on YouTube, hope that you guys are at least, getting something from these talks. But I guess to kind of, just to kind of bring everything back home, Shea, you mentioned, I know the intention of this particular episode was more so about, the voting and what sort of change we can create, at the ballot box. But then that's just one aspect of allyship in terms of the lifelong commitment to solidarity. Yeah, voting happens every so many years, but the day-to-day, the conversations that you have at work, that you overhear, friends within your own circle that may say, out-of-pocket comments and things like that need to be checked in the moment to, for a lot of us, as we keep saying, having these tough conversations with our parents that may not think the way that we think. And it's those day-to-day things. It's the small things compounded over time that create the biggest, the largest effects and stuff. So that even for myself, that's really encouraging, because on a very basic level, it's like, oh, okay, I know how to live life. I may not know about all the things that I need to go and vote for right now, but I know how to live life. I know when I hear something that in order, or rather than responding as like a haha, that's just so-and-so, and that's just how they are, being able to, address that. And yeah, the accountability is so important. And I think that's more of the day-to-day thing. That's something that we can literally do in our daily lifestyles. And so yeah, thank you so much for emphasizing that point.
I think too, just something to highlight that Shea had said earlier was, and I know coming into this, Kinjaz, the theme of this whole thing was allyship, but what I found more powerful was this idea of accomplishship, right? Like not having allies, but having an accomplice in this. The difference of an ally being temporary and an accomplice having a stake in what is happening right now. And I think that is something that I think kind of shifts this whole series, this whole narrative, even within, like, you know what I mean, the Kinjaz umbrella. So I just want to say, like, big ups on that. That was dope.
Yeah, I mean, what you said, even about the accompliceship, and even from our talk last week with Kimmy Manikas, she was saying to the next level is kinship, to treat as if they're your own family, right? As if it is your own family that is going through X, Y, or Z. Think of it from that perspective, and really take ownership, from that perspective. And I love, it's a beautiful perspective. But again, within 3 hour-long conversations, we're not going to get everything all in one, in these small talks, but we know that these talks are valuable. Like I gained so much personally from these talks, and we intend to just keep this thing going, and for us to even have a platform that we can talk, for whoever even cares to listen. We appreciate you guys, and Shay and Diane, thank you so much for giving us your time, and just sharing your knowledge. You guys are just wells of knowledge, and we hope we can kind of keep this going. And I don't know, I'm just really appreciative of you guys. You guys have any sort of closing thoughts or any encouragements that you'd want to push out there?
I think, I'll keep it short and sweet. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Philip, my cousin, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Diane, for agreeing to kind of come on this journey with me. Neither of us kind of knew exactly what we were going to get into. And I've met Diane virtually during quarantine. And so that's also kind of a silver lining in sort of everything that's happening right now, is I'm able to have virtual experiences and build virtual community with folks. And I'm glad to be building this community here. For many people, this is sort of continued work. And for others, this is the beginning of a commitment to, sort of demonstrating, hopefully, a lasting sort of engagement with with kind of combating anti-Black racism, and also supporting Black people in all ways throughout the rest of our time, right? Kind of sharing this space together. So thank you, everybody. And I'll pass it to Diane and maybe let her kind of wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm just really grateful to be building with all of you, Shaya, for just bringing me on board, starting this journey with me. It's probably not going to be the first time or last time. I don't know, something about the last question around, right, ethics of care really stood out to me. I'm definitely anti-cancel culture, right? Because it assumes that our growth is linear and that we don't have any room for mistakes or anything in between. But when I'm thinking about, what it means in different forms of solidarity, right? The ultimate goal is to move towards transformative justice, right? Which means that we have to go beyond, just simple interactions, transactional interactions, and performative things, and to really do work in places like our homes, with our families, with our communities. And so I often think of this quote from James Baldwin, right? If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. And it makes me think about how there's so much work to be done when it comes to connecting, even this conversation that we're having here, to more intimate spaces like our homes and with our families, right, with our parents, grandparents. How do we make the knowledge that we're producing here accessible to those in our communities who might not have the educational access, right, or language that we do? How do we be more imaginative, patient, inclusive, loving, and intentional with the work that we're doing with each other? Does our work reinforce existing power relations, right? Or does it help us dream of and envision a future with room for everyone, right? Every single person to get free, right? And so to answer these questions, you know, I've definitely made a more intentional effort to speak to my own family members about the world around us, right? To make connections that they can understand, to draw on their experiences, right? As refugees, immigrants, people who have literally traveled across time and across oceans to be here, right? And so we do need to build with care, right? Trust and tenderness, because there's no other way, right? We're in it for the long haul together. And so we need to be taking care of each other.
Yeah, it's amazing. No, thank you so much.
Well
Yeah, I mean, you know, we started off this conversation even in our first discussion episode. You know, Kinjaz, we're not activists by any means. We're students of life, and we just so happen to dance, you know. And so, but we do understand that we do have a platform, and you know, we care a lot about not only our output artistically, but you know, what we internally believe, which ultimately is what inspires our artistic output. So, you know, hopefully for anybody out there that digs what we do on a dance artistry level, you know, just the movement, media, and mentality is a part of our mission statement. So thank you guys for even, you know, taking the time to tune in with us and to share some thoughts. And you know, we're not gonna end this conversation here. You know, we're probably, you know, we even discussed internally after this series is over, we wanted to get into another sort of internal place where we can unpack a lot of the things that we've learned even from these, you know, few episodes. And we're gonna keep the conversation going. And again, this is us even putting it out there. You know, hold us accountable. This is our lifetime commitment to changing the way that we have been doing things and tweaking things as we need to. And you know, you got to stay humble. You got to keep moving, and this is our efforts to do that. And so again, thank you again, Shay and Diane.
thank you.
If you guys are listening here, you got it now. But if you care to, or if you want to even just go back and listen to all three of these episodes, they're going to be up. Parts 1 and 2 are up now on all streaming platforms, podcasts, and this episode will be live Friday. So yeah, feel free to go back there, and we'll plug in the resources that you guys have mentioned. I know we have brought, you know, some websites and different books and things of that nature that we'll try to plug all that stuff in the show notes so that you guys can reference and go back and read and study, watch, listen, and yeah, share this with your friends and family. You know, this is a very important conversation, and you know, I'm sure they're being had, but if you feel that this could potentially help, you know, feel free to share it with your folks. And yeah, we appreciate you guys tuning in, and thank you for your time. We'll see you on the next one. Thank you guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.